Africa. 54 countries. Over 1 billion people. Hundreds of languages. Thousands of cultures. It's a continent rich in history, resources, and resilience, yet one that has been plagued by conflicts, political instability, and divisions that often seem impossible to overcome. Why? Why do civil wars erupt again and again? Why do governments struggle to unify their people? Why do borders split tribes, merge enemies, and make nation-building so difficult? The answer isn't found in modern politics. It isn't even found in the independence movements of the 20th century. It lies further back, in a handful of meeting rooms in Europe in the late 19th century. It lies in the maps drawn by men who had never set foot on African soil. It lies in the Berlin Conference of 1884-85, and in the colonial borders carved by empires with rulers, pens, and complete disregard for the people who lived there. Welcome to Roots of the Matter. This is the story of how colonial borders broke Africa, and why the scars are still visible today. Let's dive straight in. Before we talk about how Africa was carved up, we need to understand what it looked like before the carving began. In the centuries before European colonization, Africa was not a blank map waiting to be divided. It was home to powerful kingdoms and dynamic societies. The Ashanti in West Africa, the Zulu in the south, the Sokoto Caliphate in the Sahel, the Buganda Kingdom in the Great Lakes, and dozens more. Trade routes crisscrossed the continent. Gold, ivory, salt, and slaves moved from one region to another. Complex systems of governance existed, some centralized empires, some federations, some loose alliances of clans and tribes. Borders existed, but they were fluid, shaped by culture, language, kinship, and trade rather than rigid lines on a map. People moved, intermarried, and negotiated space. And then Europe arrived, with maps, guns, and a very different idea of what a border should be. By the late 1800s, European powers were racing to expand their empires. The Industrial Revolution had increased demand for raw materials, and Africa's vast natural wealth, gold, rubber, diamonds, palm oil, and later oil, became irresistible. But this scramble for territory risked bringing Europe into conflict with itself. Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Italy, Portugal, and Spain all wanted a piece of the pie. To avoid war among themselves, they decided to sit down and divide Africa on paper. And so, in 1884, representatives from 13 European powers, and none from Africa, gathered in Berlin. The conference was convened by German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, and its purpose was simple: agree on the rules of colonizing Africa. The Berlin Conference lasted from November 1884 to February 1885. There were no African delegates, no kings, no chiefs, no representatives of the people whose lives would be changed forever. Instead, diplomats and bureaucrats sat around tables and drew lines on maps. They decided where France's empire would end and Britain's would begin. They carved out spheres of influence for Germany, Belgium, and Portugal. And they did it with almost no regard for Africa's ethnic, cultural, or historical realities. Some borders followed rivers or mountains, but many were simply geometric, straight lines drawn across deserts, forests, and kingdoms. In some cases, entire communities were split between two colonies. In others, rival groups with centuries of conflict were forced into the same political unit. By the time the scramble for Africa ended around 1914, about 90% of the continent was under European control. And the borders drawn in those colonial offices, artificial, arbitrary, and alien, would become the borders of modern African states. The consequences were immediate and profound. Suddenly, people who had never shared a political system were lumped together. Ethnic groups with deep hostilities were forced into the same borders. Communities were cut off from trade partners, religious centers, and ancestral lands. Colonial administrations often deepened these divides. They played ethnic groups against each other, favored certain communities over others, and imposed centralized governments where none had existed before. These strategies, known as divide and rule, made colonial control easier. But they planted the seeds of future conflict Nowhere is the legacy of arbitrary borders clearer than in Nigeria. Before colonial rule, the region was home to powerful and distinct societies. The Hausa Fulani caliphates in the north, the Yoruba kingdoms in the southwest, and the Igbo communities in the southeast. Each had its own governance, culture, and social structure. But the British decided to merge them into one colony, a move driven not by shared identity, but by administrative convenience. When Nigeria gained independence in 1960, it inherited that artificial union. The result? Deep divisions, political instability, and civil war. From 1967 to 1970, Nigeria was torn apart by the Biafran War, as the Igbo-majority southeast attempted to secede. Over 1 million people died, many from famine. More than 6 decades later, Nigeria remains Africa's most populous nation and one of its largest economies. But the ethnic, religious, and regional fractures created by colonial borders continue to shape its politics and fuel periodic violence. Sudan's story is another powerful example. When Britain and Egypt jointly ruled Sudan, they combined the Arab-Muslim north with a predominantly black African, Christian, and animist south. The two regions shared little in terms of culture, religion, or history, yet they were forced into a single state. After independence in 1956, Sudan was racked by decades of civil war. North and South fought over identity, religion, resources, and power, conflicts rooted in a union that never made sense to begin with. In 2011, after 2 brutal wars and millions of deaths, South Sudan became an independent nation, the first new country of the 21st century. Even so, both Sudan and South Sudan remain plagued by internal conflicts, proving that simply redrawing lines doesn't erase the colonial legacy. In Rwanda and Burundi, colonial powers didn't just ignore ethnic divisions, they hardened them. German and later Belgian colonial administrators imposed strict ethnic classifications between Hutu and Tutsi, groups that had previously shared language, culture, and often social mobility. Identity cards listed ethnicity, and colonial policy favored Tutsis for administrative roles, deepening resentment among Hutus. The result was catastrophic. Decades of tension exploded into genocide in 1994, when extremist Hutu militias killed around 800,000 Tutsis and moderate Hutus in just 100 days. This was not simply ancient tribal hatred. It was the weaponization of identity, a product of colonial policy layered on top of artificial borders. Perhaps nowhere illustrates the consequences of colonialism more starkly than the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The Congo was not just colonized, it was owned. In the late 19th century, King Leopold II of Belgium claimed it as his personal property. His regime enslaved millions, forced them to extract rubber and ivory, and committed atrocities that killed an estimated 10 million people. When independence came in 1960, the new country was a vast, poorly governed territory, with hundreds of ethnic groups, weak institutions, and borders drawn without logic. The result was chaos. Coups, assassinations, foreign interventions, and some of the deadliest conflicts since World War II. Even today, Eastern Congo remains one of the most unstable regions in the world, a direct consequence of colonial exploitation and border making. By the mid-20th century, African nations were winning independence. But they faced a dilemma. Should they redraw colonial borders or keep them? The Organization of African Unity, now the African Union, decided in 1964 that colonial borders would remain. The reasoning was pragmatic. Changing them risked even greater conflict. But this decision meant that the patchwork created in Berlin became permanent. Africa entered independence with borders that rarely reflected its peoples, and that continues to shape politics today. The political fallout of those borders has been immense. First, they've fueled conflict. Many African civil wars, from Biafra to Darfur to Ethiopia's Tigray conflict, have roots in colonial-era divisions. Second, they've weakened states. Governments must balance competing ethnic groups, often leading to fragile coalitions, military coups, or authoritarian rule. Third, they've shaped foreign relations. Colonial-era divisions often align with economic interests, leaving countries vulnerable to outside influence, a reality visible in China's and Russia's growing roles across the continent today. The social costs are just as significant. Colonial borders fractured cultural and linguistic communities. Families and tribes found themselves on opposite sides of national lines. Traditional governance systems were replaced with imported Western models. This disruption often eroded social cohesion and made national identity harder to build. Many Africans today identify more strongly with their ethnic group than with the state, a reality that complicates efforts at unity and nation building. At the same time, colonial borders created hybrid identities and new forms of solidarity. Pan-Africanism, the idea of African unity across artificial divisions, emerged partly as a response to colonial fragmentation. Today, the legacy of colonial borders is visible everywhere. In Mali and Burkina Faso, fragile states struggle against insurgencies that exploit ethnic divisions. In Ethiopia, a multi-ethnic federation wrestles with competing nationalisms. In Nigeria, Boko Haram's insurgency feeds on historical marginalization. And in the Sahel, conflicts often follow colonial-era lines rather than natural or cultural ones. Even economic development is shaped by those old maps. Landlocked countries, created by colonial partition, face structural disadvantages. Infrastructure often connects former colonies to European ports rather than neighboring states. In many ways, Africa's map is not just a relic of history. It's an ongoing obstacle to the future. Can Africa's borders ever be fixed? Some argue that the answer is integration, not redrawing. Regional organizations like the African Union and economic blocs like ECOWAS and the East African Community aim to make borders less significant by promoting free movement, trade, and political cooperation. Others advocate decentralization, giving local communities more autonomy within existing states. But perhaps the deeper challenge is not about lines on a map, but about how nations build identities and institutions strong enough to transcend them. The story of Africa's borders is not just about history, it's about power. It's about who drew the lines, who benefited from them, and who has lived with their consequences. The Berlin Conference lasted just a few months, but its decisions reshaped a continent for centuries. It split families, ignited wars, weakened states, and still defines politics, economies, and identities today. Africa's borders don't not work by accident. They were never meant to. They were designed to serve empires, not nations. Yet despite this, Africa endures. It innovates. It builds. And it continues to seek ways to turn those colonial scars into new possibilities. Because the story of Africa is not just one of what was done to it, but what it continues to do for itself. And to understand that story, the struggles, the conflicts, and the resilience, we have to go back to the roots of the matter. That's it on this edition of the program. If you've watched this far, why not subscribe Roots of the Matter, where Forgotten History explains today's biggest headlines. Join the comment section and suggest what Africa can do moving forward. Share the video to someone else who needs to see this. Thank you.